Hey everyone, welcome back to session 5 of the Debate Hub. In today's video, we'll go over the back half speeches, the summary, the final focus, as well as critical components like weighing. Before we dive into the contents of today's video, let's have a quick quiz time of what we learned last video, in the rebuttal video. List two types of responses in a debate round that garners your side offense. So as a quick hint, both these types of responses have the word turn attached to their name. Take a quick pause of the video if you need some time. The answers are link and impact terms. So congratulations if you got that correct. Great. With that out of the way, let's now get into the crux of today's content, the back half speeches. Just like front half speeches, back half speeches come with their own set of norms and nuances. Because the summary and the final focus are intended to whittle down the debate to its one or two core issues, debate speeches get shorter and shorter progressively, from 4 minutes for each constructive speech, 3 minutes for each summary, and finally only 2 minutes for the final focus speech. The only hard rule you have to keep in mind for these two speeches is that no new arguments are allowed. You can still go back and forth on existing ones, but nothing new. A quick pro tip, the summary and the final focus should generally mirror each other. Think of the final focus as a condensed version of the summary that jettisons a key point or two to focus all of your time on one or two good arguments that you have the best chance of winning the round on. Quick story time. When I just started learning debate, I was always pretty caught up with the back half speeches. You know, front half speeches were always pretty simple since it was a mere matter of making arguments and then refuting your opponent's arguments. But back half speeches were far less formulaic. Hopefully, the following ways of thinking about the summary and final focus will help it make sense for you, since that's what instantly switched the light bulb for me. You may have heard the old idiom, throw things at the wall and see what sticks. But that's really what public forum is. In the front half, you spread your opponents thin with a bunch of different arguments called horizontal proliferation, and then in the back half, you pick a couple of those and go really in depth called vertical proliferation. In that way, you can think of the back half speeches like a funnel. You have a bunch of arguments at the beginning, but you shrink and shrink as the debate progresses. This process of choosing a select one or two arguments is called collapsing. During this process, you pick and choose your best arguments and put all of your eggs in those few baskets. If there's one thing you should take away from this lecture, it's the foolproof three-step process: extend, frontline, and weigh, which means that you can foolproof collapse in every single debate. When you extend an argument, you should restate each individual part of that argument briefly: the uniqueness, the link, and the impact. Then, you should defend your argument against each one of your opponent's response using the they say but format. Finally, you must weigh your arguments. We'll cover this shortly, but for now, it's basically explaining why your argument is fundamentally more important than your opponent's. The primary thing that makes excellent national level debaters unique is their ability to pick and choose arguments. Before we get to know how, know that you should be collapsing on offense, not defense. Simply put, offense is an argument that advocates for your side of the resolution, and defense is an argument that disproves your opponent's argument. The easiest way to pick and choose or collapse in a debate round is to strike the delicate balance between importance and resistance. Importance describes how strong an argument is, aka how true it is, and consequently how much utility that argument will provide you in a round. Resistance, on the other hand, is what are the hoops you need to jump through to win off that argument, or what are the hoops you need to jump through to prove that argument is true in the first place. The best case is that your opponents haven't adequately responded to your most important argument. But in many cases, this can't be true, and it's best to collapse on an argument that isn't the most logically sound or backed by evidence, but one that isn't well responded to, or maybe an argument that is really good, but also has a ton of responses from the other side which you need to surmount. The other skill that separates top debaters is weighing. Before we take a deep dive into the nuances of weighing, a precursor to understanding weighing is to understand why many of the arguments we make impact out to human extinction, whether that be via nuclear war or environmental degradation or some other blown up factor. If you understand why debate has gone in this direction, you fundamentally understood the importance of weighing. Larger impacts, like the death of the human race, is far more important to a judge's decision-making calculus and therefore will be prioritized even if your opponent is winning a set of their own arguments as well.
With that in mind, what is weighing? Weighing explains why the judge should vote for you, even if both you and your opponent's arguments are true. In other words, it explains why the judge should prioritize your argument instead of your opponent's.
There are many different metrics that you can use to weigh. The first and arguably most prominent is magnitude. It questions how bad an impact is. Magnitude is a catch-all term for other buzzwords that you might hear debaters use, like severity, which is how severe an impact is, as well as scope, which is how many people an impact affects. For instance, although a car crash only affects one person, it is extremely severe. Therefore, you could argue that it is more important to prevent a car crash than it is to prevent 10,000 people from getting paper cuts.
Second is probability, which questions how likely an argument is to be true. The asteroids killed off the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, so you could technically argue it's very likely for it to happen to humans as well. But the reason why the government doesn't invest every single last penny into asteroid prevention is because it's very unlikely compared to other impacts, like for example, the effects of poverty and unemployment. A probability argument would say we should focus on the arguments, like the ones I just named, that are far more likely to occur in the first place.
Magnitude and probability are entangled in many ways. While there are many different ways to ask your judges to frame impacts, most judges will default to a utilitarian scale. In mathematical terms, an impact is determined by how bad it is multiplied by how likely it is. If you win, your impact is both terrible and likely, you're golden. But many debates will devolve to impacts that are either devastating but unlikely or likely but not relatively terrible.
The third and final weighing mechanism is called time frame, which questions how quickly an impact actually occurs. Though both climate change and war have severe consequences, a reason to prioritize war over conflict is that the impacts of climate change are ongoing and decades down the line, but the impacts of war are immediate. Time frame isn't important on its own, but it's externally important for three reasons. First is an argument called intervening actors. If an argument happens 100 years down the line, even if it has the potential to cause extinction, in the future, international agencies, treaties like the Paris Accords, and domestic action is likely to solve those consequences, even if the resolution doesn't happen. So this is pretty prevalent if you hit an impact like climate change, for example. The second reason why time frame is important is packaged in a quote called, "You've lived to fight another day." That translates from debate lingo into simply more life years. If extinction is guaranteed from both climate change and war, and voting AF solves climate change, for example, and voting neg solves war, but neither side can solve each other's impact, it's at least better to stop the imminent war, given that you can live a few extra years because the war happens faster than climate change. The third and most important reason to win time frame is that it dictates the direction of Turn's case. We'll explain Turn's case more deeply on the next slide. What it basically entails is that if you win your argument, then their argument cannot be true or you solve their argument. If your impact is now faster on time frame, that means if both sides have Turn's case arguments, you turn their case before they can turn yours.
So, what is Turn's case? Turn's case is a mechanism for impact calculus that's rapidly gaining popularity in the national circuit for its strategic utility. The reason why it's so potent is that it allows you to access all of your opponent's arguments, even if their arguments are extremely bad, which is magnitude, or extremely likely, which is probability. It doesn't matter so long as your impacts will also cause theirs. As you get into debates, you'll hear turns case arguments packaged in many different ways. Debaters might call it prerequisites, saying that if your case doesn't happen, then theirs can't happen either, or a short circuit. Regardless of the name that your opponents use to package turns case, you should think of it like this. If your impacts happen, so do theirs. Or if you solve your impacts, you can simultaneously solve their impacts, which means that in either world, you can access their wing.
So let's dive into some examples. let's take the classic example of climate change turning war and war turning climate change, a 100-year-old debate classic. If I was on the climate change turns war side, I could potentially make the following arguments. First, the worse climate change gets, the more likely war is. Climate change causes resource shortages, natural disasters, and instability across the globe, all of which are potential new starting points for new wars, aka resource wars. Second, solving climate change has the potential to solve war in the interim. Depending on your case, you might solve climate change through mechanisms like international collaboration, for example, like the Paris Accords. In these instances, leaders come together, amending sour relationships that might have driven the war in the first place. Now, let's take the side of war turning climate change. A simple argument you can make is that during war, the military industrial complex is on full force. During World War II, for example, all of our factories started mass producing weapons, caring about the immediate war far more than using equipment that might be more environmentally friendly, for example. Even more so, dropping large bombs on swaths of land, even nuclear war, doesn't seem like a pleasant gift for Mother Earth. Another argument you can make, on the contrary to the one about climate change turning war for global collaboration, is that during conflict, antagonisms prevent collaboration. If the United States and China were actively fighting World War III, what's the chance that Biden and Xi are going to take their time to sit down at the next climate conference and act all buddy buddy? The probability is probably pretty low. Here's a quick hack for Turn's case. It can happen at every part of the link, not just at the impact level. And in fact, it's probably beneficial for you if your turns case arguments are happening earlier up on the link chain, so you have to win less of your argument. This was exemplified on the slide above. Although it's technically called climate change versus war, which are both impacts, the turns case for climate change, the subpoint called global collaboration, actually happened earlier up in the link chain. We don't have to win that climate change causes extinction, the terminal impact, to prove that the collaboration and the negotiations that climate change solvency may foster may also lead to better amendments between leaders.
Once again, thank you so much for coming to session 5 of the Debate Hub. We hope to see you back next time.